following discussion is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first speaking with your doctor.
What is up, everyone, and welcome to the Diabetes podcast, where we discuss how to take control of your health and gain the freedom to live the life that you deserve. I'm Gary Pano, and with me is my co-host, Dr. Grady Donahoe, who is a board-certified chiropractic internist. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Diabetes podcast. Today, we have a very special guest and super excited for this conversation. With us today, we have John Roth, who is a professional pilot, and he's been paving the way to have more type 1 diabetics have access to this profession of aviation. And I think it'll be very clear as you hear throughout this conversation, the passion in his voice to make change and to really say, even if you're diabetic, that doesn't mean that you have to be limited on what you can do. So welcome, John, to the podcast.
Hi, guys. Again, very excited to be talking with you and look forward to having a good conversation about things.
Yeah, absolutely. Us too. Let's kind of just do like a little bit of introduction of John, who you are, and kind of say in your own stuff, in your own story, and maybe like your diagnosis story to start off with, and so people can kind of get acclimated to what's going on.
Absolutely. So to kind of get things started, currently I'm working with a regional airline as a flight instructor, basically teaching airline pilots, and currently working on the last portions of getting my medical certification back for my commercial airline career that was abruptly cut short or put on pause, as I like to say now, due to a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes when I was 37 years old. So pretty late in life, and just kind of the process to get there, I guess can be part of the portion of the show. And then also some of the things that, many others, including myself, have been working on over the last few years to kind of break down some of those barriers for insulin-dependent diabetics, both type 1 and type 2, to either be able to continue or resume or begin a career in commercial aviation, and some of the things that have led into that. So as I said before, I was diagnosed, and depending on your point of view, some might who have had type 1 probably from a very young age, some might say, well, I'm kind of glad I never knew the difference, because then it alleviates some of that, I don't know, maybe regret or, feeling of missing out. But on my end, I was fortunate. I feel like I was fortunate to live a good chunk of my life without type 1. And the perspective that I feel that gives me is that I'm very thankful for basically that life both before and the perspective that the type 1 diagnosis has given me, both on, the way I want to continue living my life and, a new, interest and focus on health. And then also basically just trying to help others that have found themselves in a similar situation.
Wow. So that's a crazy. How did you find out you were diabetic at the age of 37? Yeah. Like you had this literally entire life. What did you get? Go in DKA? Was it just a general checkup? What was that scenario at that moment in your life?
Yeah, so it was definitely a progression, and it's one of those deals where I think a lot of people who are diagnosed later on, or even parents maybe that have kids that were diagnosed, looking back and now knowing the symptoms and the things to look for, it was quite obvious that that's where things were going. But at the time when you're kind of amongst it, and you're not aware of the fact that, type 1 can, come on so late in life, you just don't think to look for it. So, the items, or the, I guess, time frame that led up to my diagnosis was somewhere in early October of 2014. I noticed that I started to have, a little bit of, blurred vision. Not so much blurred, but just felt like my contacts, because I do wear contacts, like my prescription was going, was changing. And at first I thought that was a little weird, because I haven't had any change in my vision for, until that point, almost 15 years. I mean, I had the same prescription, same everything, no issues. And then I went into an optometrist, and, they just, I had no history of diabetes, of course. And, if this is just those who are just listening to the audio, I've kind of always put a focus on athletics and trying to stay fit, trying to stay healthy. And so, the old phrase probably applied, "You don't look diabetic," which is, we all know is not accurate. But, so they didn't, I just don't think they looked for it. And so, they gave me a different prescription, and, it seemed to help, but then other days it wouldn't help as much. And I kind of noticed at work at the time, I was an airline pilot, and still am with the same company, but just seeing things at a great distance, which we have to do as pilots, runways out, 30, 40, 50 miles away, other aircraft, seeing numbers on the sides of aircraft and taxiways. Every once in a while, those would be a little blurry. And I just was like, well, this isn't right. Something's wrong with my prescription. I come to find out later that was probably a byproduct of, significantly variable blood glucose values causing the inflammation in the eye and the retina, and those capillaries in there. But that was kind of the very earliest sign, I think. And then it kind of progressed later on in November timeframe into probably the 1st of December. I started to lose weight. It was kind of like the way my wife tells the story is, like, each time I'd come home from a trip, like a 3 or 4 day trip, she'd kind of wonder if I was eating enough, or, was, taking care of myself properly on the road, because she's like, it was noticeable even within a 4 day trip, I'd come home and I would look thinner. Wow. And, I wasn't noticing it. I was still trying to get workouts in. I was still trying to remain active, which probably was, responsible for me being able to sustain as long as I did, because I was probably cutting down, some of the glucose that was going on there and keeping me out of ketoacidosis. But, and then, I started to then get, the thirst, as everybody says, I started to get really, really thirsty all the time. And, was having trouble making it through an 1.5 hour, 2 hour long flight without having to go back and hit the lab in the airplane, which was abnormal for me. And then, it just kind of progressed to the point where in January, so the first week in January, I got back from a trip, and it was a 3 day trip, had a couple days off, and I was supposed to go back out on another 3 day trip. And I was, down in the kitchen, making, this is the funny part, some waffles with blueberries on it. But, just feeling like death warmed over. And I just I told my wife, she had just come back from a night shift. She is a veterinarian, but was doing a night shift. And I just told her, I said, I'm gonna have to call in, sick. I go, I can't, I'm not fit for duty, which is another term in aviation that you have to do a self-assessment to say, am I fit to duty to take responsibility of this aircraft and these people on the aircraft? And I take that very, very seriously. And I just said, no, I cannot report to work like this. It's not like, going into, a position where, if you mess up at work, you just go back and redo the paperwork. This is, a little bit higher stake. So she said, well, you're not only calling out for work, we're going to the emergency room, because at that point she had just said, I had enough. And at that point, I sit where I'm at weight-wise, about 175 pounds. And at that time, I had lost 27 pounds. So I was just, below like 150. So I lost a lot of weight.
Wow.
Yeah. So we went down to the ER and kind of gave them my symptoms, and they, did a finger stick, as the story goes, and it read high. Of course. And then they walked me back, kind of parted the waters, as I like to say, in the emergency room, which is never good. Put me back in a bed, and I came to find out later on my medical record that when they actually measured the blood glucose at that time, it was 897.
Wow, that's
it was
so
up
high.
there.
Oh my God, 890. You were so close to 900. You could have got that.
I know, I just missed it by that much. So yeah, and of course, being a pilot and knowing that there's two components of airline pilot certificates in general, depending on what level you hold, you have to have different categories of medical classification, 1 through 3. And as an airline pilot, you have to hold first class medical. And so something that's always in the back of your brain as an airline pilot or a pilot in general is your fitness for duty and your ability to hold that medical certificate. So while I'm sitting there, in the ICU waiting to get transferred wherever, they haven't decided what to do with me yet. Of course, I'm, on my iPad looking up, this, potential condition as it pertains to my medical. And, you pull it right up, on the FAA website under their AeroMed department, and it just says insulin-treated diabetes is a disqualifying event for all first, second, and partially third class medical certificates.
Wow.
And at which point you're kind of sitting there, and I saw, to that point would have been a 20-year trajectory, just take a hard landing.
Yeah.
So to use some aviation stuff in there, but so then you're just kind of faced with what next.
Wow. At that moment, were you just trying to process what was going on, or did you think that was it? Or, it's one thing to be diagnosed and think, wow, my life is going to change. Like, I don't know what this means yet, but after so many years, you said 20 years you were training essentially, and you was training and you were active pilot.
Yeah, I got my first level of pilot certificates when I was 17 years old. So I've been up to that point. I've been flying, privately and then commercially for 20 years. So yeah.
So at that point, were you more concerned, how can I get this back? Or were you more concerned, what does this mean for my health? I mean, this situation kind of goes hand in hand, but I feel like most people don't have to think about that at their diagnosis. I feel like that was like your first thought,
Yeah, it was absolutely. As you said, there really was a kind of a duality to it, which is, first and foremost, not only how is it going to affect me, but how is this going to affect my family, my wife, Sarah, and, how am I going to, continue to, provide, from a career standpoint. And then, with that career, something that I, still care a great deal about. And, that kind of rolls into when you see that finite print, as the disqualifying event, then your brain kind of, I think, depending on the person, you have two ways of looking at that. And I've, talked about this on one other interview where, you have that mental capacity to say, is this something that's going to basically crush you and allow you to take that tangent and allow it to stop you? Or can you take the mental choice of saying, okay, this is a massive obstacle. It potentially is going to be a long and difficult road and or flight. How can I overcome this? Is it possible? Is it reasonable? And, then how do I go about pursuing that goal of overcoming this? And, I had a good amount of time to think about it in the hospital. I was in the ICU for a night and, sent my wife, asked her to go home. I didn't send it. That sounds bad. But I asked her to go home because she had been up in excess of 24 hours at that point because she came off a night shift. And had some time to think about it. And, I just said, this is, when I get out of the hospital and I get a handle on this, I'm going to start digging and find out if this really is something that I can, advocate and overcome, or is it something that, if I talk to the right people that feel that this is not something that will change, is there a different capacity that I could still stay in the aviation industry, or, look for other, I guess, ways to continue with the career that I spent so long trying to attain. So yeah, I just had to utilize that from a professional standpoint. And then, I'm also a big proponent, and, everyone has their down times and everyone has their times when they think, oh, stuff's really mounting, stuff's really piling up and it's hard to stay positive. But, you got to turn to what you do have, and at that point, I said, wow, I have, a loving, caring wife that, cared enough to say, we need to go to the hospital. I had, good family structure around me. I had or have, a lot of other things outside of my career that I also enjoy. And as I started to read into it, it was one of those things where I said, this is going to be a significant, you know, learning curve to deal with this and learn how to do or manage this disease safely. But I also thought, well, even if I can't fly again at a commercial level, I can still go mountain bike. I can still go backpacking. I can still enjoy the outdoors. I can still be active. I can still go lift weights. I can still spend time with my family. So, it's the old 80-20 rule. I had 20% that was in jeopardy of losing, and I had 80% that was still there, that was still really good and worth, having positivity for. And, that's the way I, opted to look at it rather.
Wow. Yeah. I love that mindset. You brought up a couple different mindsets that you were kind of going through, but like looking at an obstacle as an obstacle of something that you just need to figure out how to overcome that. But then also like what you just said there of, I still have 80% of my life that I can do. It's just that 20% that's still up in the air. And so I think that's a great mindset to look at as far as like, it's easy to focus on that 20% because it can seem like such a big part of your life because like you said, you've done that for 20 years. And I'm sure you have a lot of other skills that you can utilize to make a living and whatnot. But obviously you love aviation and that's what you want to do and pursue. So it can be easy to focus on that and say, woe is me. And, this is going to be, a disaster or hell or whatever. So to be able to take a step back, look at your life and say, all right, I still have a great life, but there's just going to be this obstacle that I got to get over. And I think for a lot of diabetics, type 1 diabetes is a big obstacle or a big thing that you have to navigate in your life. And so just looking at it objectively and saying, okay, this is tough, but these are the things I need to do to overcome this. So the question I want to ask off of that is, at the time that you're diagnosed, I know you said that there wasn't, or you automatically were disqualified for class 1 and class 2, and in some cases class 3. At that time, were there any diabetics that were trying to make a change for those class 1, class 2s?
Yeah. So as I started to research I guess, issue, there were definitely some folks that had already started that track, so to speak. And, those who aren't exposed to or have not been exposed to government regulations and or laws, they're inherently maddening to kind of sort your way through. And the way the wording was in the federal regulations in 2015 was that it wasn't wholly prohibited, meaning it was, a complete disqualifying event. It was a disqualifying event for what they call a standard issue or a normal first, second, or third class medical. But it said that, you could apply for, and it would be assessed on a case-by-case basis for what's called a special issuance medical. And depending on which class, all just depended on the application and what the intent of use was going to be. So that, shed a little ray of potential or hope there to that situation. And, where I went with that bit of information is then to get in contact with a couple private organizations that advocate for commercial airline pilots with the FAA. regarding aeromedical conditions, because there are many other medical conditions that are allowed under a special issuance medical, some of which are cardiac, neurologic, some of them like certain forms of sleep apnea, type 2 diabetes, that's controlled with oral medication was allowed at the time. And just a whole, gamut of things that were allowed. And at that point, no insulin-treated diabetic had been approved. But there was, one pilot in particular who was a American Airlines pilot that actually took a legal case all the way through to the U.S. District Court because he had applied for a first-class medical, and basically had kind of, I don't know, I guess you could call it, was stonewalled to a point where they had neither denied it nor approved it, and had kind of kept him, in limbo for multiple years. And at some point, he just was able to get enough legal support to pursue this case and basically bring a lawsuit against the Federal Aviation Administration, which is no small task.
Yeah.
And so that was in 2015. And then him along with, others had already started that kind of push to try and make this possible. And another thing that was, I guess, used as a data point or something to shore up that petition to the FAA was that in 2015, other countries were already allowing insulin-treated diabetics to operate commercially. Scotland, Ireland, the UK, and Canada, and if I recall, there was one other country in the Middle East, and then one in South America. I can't remember off the top of my head, but they were allowing it. And the people that were looking at bringing this to the FAA used their examples in that during the last, I think at that time they had about 7 years of flight crews that were operating. They'd never had any of those flight crews have an issue with their diabetic management in flight. And so as a, kind of a proof positive to say, hey, as long as this is managed correctly, it's safe. And then so I just, got in touch with, that particular pilot, talked with him about the case. The district court actually ruled in his favor and against, not really against, but basically told the FAA, you need to provide a reason why you're denying or not proceeding with this application. And they gave him a time frame, and that kind of got the ball rolling. And anytime you're dealing with lawsuits, or particularly the federal government, things move, but like they say, at a glacial pace, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of that thing where you see it 100 miles off, and then it's still 99 miles away 5 years later,
Yeah.
But nonetheless, there was some movement, and so I started to get involved with that. And through one of these aeromedical organizations, I got into contact with a couple aviation medicine physicians, and basically submitted all of my data, CGM data, all my endocrinology reports, blood work, everything that they could possibly need, so that they had a data set. And then that physician, Dr. Quay Snyder, utilized my data and the data of a couple other pilots in his presentations at some of the national and international air and space and aeromed conferences, to show, that, of course they took my name off of it and the other people's name, but they used that data to show, that properly controlled, here's your standard deviation, here's your coefficient of variation, here's the high and lows, and here's the proof to say that this person is not only not a risk, but potentially is less of a risk than somebody that isn't continuously doing blood work every 3 months and isn't controlling with nutrition and doesn't wear a continuous glucose monitor and so on. And, that was also, provided to be, data to help move along this process of, trying to get the FAA to, see what the technology was, what was available through CGMs, and what it was capable of, and in the right hands of a, motivated diabetic that wants to focus on, stability, that it
Hmm.
doesn't need to be a disqualifying event, provided that person is well informed and is using the technology and the medication correctly. So.
Wow. Do you mind sharing? Because, we can get nitpicky, not nitpicky, but get nitty gritty. Do you mind sharing some of those, what, if you remember, some of those standard deviations or what the numbers were like? Oh, John has, his average glucose is this. He only is in lows this percent of time. Do you remember any of those numbers? And I would figure that they'd probably be more worried about hypoglycemia than hyper, for long-term flying. So what's some of the obstacles that the actual data and as they were trying to prove you and others and make headway into like, hey, a healthy motivated diabetic can do this? What were some of the numbers that they were showing that it's possible, or that they were trying to stop saying that's not okay, or you need to pass this criteria?
Right. So initially during, prior to my involvement, and then up until November of last year of 2019, there was no published protocol. And that's one of the things that we were, myself and others were working towards, kind of pressuring the FAA to come up with a published protocol to say, here's what we're looking for, and this
Mm.
is what we want submitted, to have a standardization so that we could then send that in. And I'll come back to your first question later, like what were they looking at beforehand. But once they issued the protocols, that's now published, and they actually revised it in September of this year to have tighter tolerances. Prior to that, that was the difficult part, was that there was no standard, that the FAA was looking at. But you're absolutely correct. Their main item, their main concern was hypoglycemia, right? Because that could potentially, be an incapacitating event and, compromise your cognitive ability, in the air. So with that said, we use the CGM data to show them and to make sure that the powers that be at the FAA in Washington, D.C. were aware of what the technology was capable of, i.e. CGMs, right? And, with the Dexcom and some of the other CGMs, but mainly the Dexcom because of the FDA approval, and especially with the advent of the G6, where it had FDA approval for no finger sticks,
Mm.
that was a big component, a couple of years ago to help move the process along. Um, but our position with the CGMs was that it gives you, alerts that you can change, and you can say, I want this to alert me at 90 or 100 or wherever you want us to alert us at. We can set it to do that, so that it would basically take a deliberate act not to correct an impending low blood sugar. So it's not just this, pie in the sky, like you're walking down the street and, you start seeing tacos and trees because you have a low blood glucose.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You're going to get a warning, and it's going to be significant. And and so that's where our, first standpoint was to say, this technology is capable of this. What do you want? And that's what we had to kind of pry out of it, or, petition the FAA to give us. And, with that, going back to your question, right after diagnosis. So, my first, HbA1c when when they diagnosed me in the hospital, of course, was, outrageous. I mean, it was
Mhm.
13.2, I believe.
Wow. Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
but, with that, once, I started to educate myself and started to find out, the, I guess the nature of the disease, my next 6-month A1C was a 6.1, and then my 9-month A1C was a 5.3, and I've never ventured above 5.6 from, then on. I've never gone above 5.6.
Wow. It's
And
amazing. Even without your aviation story, like that's a huge feat in itself. That's awesome.
yeah, and to say that, I do, take some degree of pride in that, but it's completely attainable for anyone. It's
Mm-hmm.
not, it's not. I by no means think that I'm special in that nature. It's just a matter of taking the knowledge, figuring out how it applies to you, your body, and your lifestyle, and
Mm-hmm.
applying it. It sounds oversimplified, but I do feel genuinely that it really is that simple. And trying
Mm-hmm.
things out, like you guys talked about, even on some of your most recent episodes with
Mm-hmm.
nutrition, the same
Mm-hmm.
nutrition isn't going to work for everyone, but
Right.
there's some base principles that is your starting point, and then you need to
Mm-hmm.
try different things from there to figure out what works for you. And to go back to again, I'm going off on little tangents here, but
Mm-hmm.
the basis of that, and when I started to look at what the FAA was going to be looking for, it was just that stability. You had to be able to show that you were stable, and besides having an infinite other health benefits besides my career relationship, that was, paramount to if this was going to become a possibility. Every physician I talked to was to say, we believe this is possible, not now, but it will be. We're confident about that. We don't know how long it'll take, but we believe this is going to be possible. But the key component is going to be, utilizing this technology and being able to show that you're stable. And so that was kind of one of the things that pushed me to utilize my prior degree from college and to be more I guess persistent on finding out ways to become more stable as a diabetic, and then parlay that into the FAA and trying to get our medicals back. And then so I don't go too long on this, the very first protocol that finally came out in November of 2019 from the FAA it's called ITDM, so insulin treated diabetes mellitus. Um, the first statement was the range that they were looking for. They didn't give A1Cs, and they did not stipulate in the protocol a standard deviation or coefficient of variation, but they gave the range was basically 70 to 250, which is a pretty wide range.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Is pretty generous, but it was a starting point, and that's what we asked for. And then the most recent one that has come out, they had a board of endocrinologists that they consulted with, and they basically moved it to the more current ADA recommendations, which was 70 to 180. And then the FAA, because they want to give a more of a buffer for low hypoglycemic events, have moved that now to 80 to 180. So there's a 100-point range there that they want you to stay in. And then with the standard deviation, they want that to be less than 35, and the coefficient of variation, they want that to be less than 40. So it's tight parameters, and so any type ones out there that are hearing that use CGM or that are aware of what those numbers mean, they're not unattainable, but they are tight. And so I have seen there's that 2% of people that are very negative. When all this came out and it started to make its way through social media, there was this I got a flood of people that the negative 2%ers are like, oh, I'd never get on an airplane with a diabetic, and they were diabetics themselves. They're like,
Really?
that's totally unsafe, that's impossible. Like, I'm never getting on a plane with a diabetic pilot and this and that. And I'm just like, well, I'm sorry you think that. I really truly am, because that in my mind is not, I don't take offense to it. I feel compassion for them because I feel like they've given up on themselves. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it really is unfortunate because it just shows their mindset on, like you said, what is possible. And you can tell that if they can't achieve something like that or those numbers or stability like that, they feel like that's not possible, and therefore anybody who is a type 1 diabetic, that they should not be able to fly an airplane because they're going to be like me. They get low all the time And so, yeah, that's just really unfortunate that a lot of people have that mindset, because it just shows you how defeated they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I think some of that, again, coming in contact with folks that I've, coached a little bit, in the aviation space. And even when I've done JDRF events, it's just, there's a lot of, incomplete information or antiquated information that people are being given. And, unfortunately for some folks, when that's their basis, um, it, it's just hard for them to dig out of that hole. And, that's why, your message and your content that you're putting out, and, I think is so important, so that, people can get a hold of newer, better, correct information that can have extremely positive effects on their health and their life and their diabetic management, and I think, those people that hear this and the folks that I talk with, just try some of this stuff, like we can talk a little bit if you want about various diets and exercise and things like that I do outside of aviation. But, the way I started it was, hey, I had breakfast, a couple weeks after I got out of the hospital, and I'm sitting there eating, and we were gluten-free beforehand because my sister actually has, diagnosed gluten sensitivities, and she has a neurologic. I mean, you guys are in, the functional medicine space. So, a lot of times, like, gluten sensitivity can manifest, from a gastroenterologic manifestations, like, gut issues, or sometimes they'll have neurologic issues. And she was, had the neurologic side of it, where they thought that she had a seizure disorder. And,
Wow.
She luckily recognized, because she's a very, very experienced pediatric intensive care nurse, the medications they wanted to put her on. And she said, absolutely not. I'm going to go research this more, and found out that she had a gluten sensitivity. So where I was going with that is, I was already, we were already gluten free and, eating fairly healthy. But, I just started off, I started reading, oh, hey, apparently carbohydrates seem to be a major problem for diabetics. So, maybe instead of 2 gluten-free waffles that are made out of tapioca starch, maybe I'll have 1 and see what that does. And hey, look at that. My blood sugar didn't go up to, 180, and I didn't have to blast myself with as much insulin. Yeah, that was nice. Like, maybe I'll continue with that, So.
That was nice. That's funny. Yeah, let's take a second, because I wanted to go in 2 ways. I want to finish the aviation story, but let's take a second to talk a little bit more about nutrition and what you've been doing. So it sounds like you did a lot of self-experimentation right off the get-go, which was great. And also I wanted to comment on, because some people who might not hear, because we don't talk about gluten sensitivities a whole lot yet, or we haven't yet. But one of the first convincing things I saw was so your cerebellum is one of the parts of your brain that help coordination, essentially, of movement. And there is documented MRIs of cerebellar atrophy due to gluten, in some people. And even in the type 1 world, because I was about to say, there's 2 ways an adult can be type 1, is that you can already have like this insulin resistant model and end up burning out your beta cells, which that's kind of how they started thinking, okay, adults could be type 1. But then there's other, which has this different title, but late onset autoimmune, or essentially you're just same pathology of a type 1 of autoimmune disorder, just later on in life. And that sounds like what you kind of fell down that rabbit hole of, that pathway of being diagnosed as a type 1 of a true autoimmunity, beta cell destruction type pathology. And so those 2 are very distinct. And now I want to keep going on rambles, but let's keep it focused on what you were doing right away in those experimentations, what you do to have that 13 all the way down to 6 to 5, point whatever, A1C. How did you start really managing it?
Yeah, so initially, when I got out of the hospital, and then got home, there was there was just that initial week or 2 where you kind of feel, when you get a hold of insulin that you haven't had in a while, you kind of feel the life, kind of come back into you. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody probably can relate to that if you were
Mhm.
old enough to remember,
Mhm.
your experience. And with that, you then I started to look at nutrition, and it's been a progress, over the last 5 years. I think I've refined things and tried some stuff and abandoned other things, and um, and become more diligent about the quality of nutrition and what my wife and I choose to eat, and so on. But on the very first beginnings of that was just that was before I had a CGM. I got on Dexcom G4 probably 6 months after my diagnosis, so I was very fortunate
Yeah,
with
that's
that.
awesome.
But even with finger sticks, I mean, I went and got additional test strips, so I could test more. I went online and found a couple really good online kind of training, computer-based training modules that explained a lot about diabetes type 1 and athletics. There's actually a guy in Australia that had a really good program put together, which I'm not sure if it's still available, but he specifically was a triathlete and coached.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So he coached various type 1 athletes, and so on those modules they started to talk about the carb to insulin ratios and trying to figure those out. And admittedly, so prior to being diagnosed, I was a standard endurance slash strength athlete where higher carbohydrates. I don't know how many carbohydrates I ate, but I could tell you one thing: when I went for a big mountain bike ride, I was probably crushing through 300-400 carbohydrates in a ride on a
Mhm.
4-hour ride.
Right.
So I certainly was not low carb by any stretch of the means. But I was saying, well, apparently, that is, one of the, agitators of the disease. So I said that seems to be where I need to focus most of my attention on. And so I just started to, experiment, like what we were just saying with, I used to have, eggs with a couple of gluten-free waffles and a little bit of, sugar-free syrup on there. And I said, well, what happens if I just take the syrup off and I put blueberries on there instead? Oh, look at that. It made a 20, 40, 60 point difference in your blood glucose. Oh,
Mhm.
hey, what if I just have one waffle instead of two? What happens if I make those waffles out of flaxseed and almond flour instead of tapioca starch? And started to test
Mm.
some of these things to see how it responded. And I just kind of started honing more and more into, if it was more fibrous, if it was more natural sources, the less processed it was, the better response my body had to it, not only from a blood glucose standpoint, but from, how you felt, at that mealtime throughout the rest of the day. And another big component that I noticed very quickly was, how important it is to, for me anyway, to start the day off, as stable as possible. So don't kick the hornet's nest at 6 a.m. and, spend the rest of the day running, you know,
Mhm.
uh, just, if you can avoid a big giant spike in the morning, you're going to
Mhm.
have a much better trajectory for the rest of the day. And I just kind of started to use that as a basis and, honed in more and more on learning more about that and learning more about different nutritional protocols, through podcasts and online. And luckily we live in an age now where you can get a ton of information. Some of it is complete garbage, but it's information nonetheless, but some of it
Right.
is absolute garbage. Um,
Mhm.
so, I just started to, find stuff out and try and find credible sources and physicians and folks like yourselves, that,
Mhm.
you know, that were just trying to tell the truth. And I then would research that and then say, yeah, that sounds right, and tried it for myself. And just kind of dug into it from there. Is kind of the long answer.
Wow. I love that analogy. Don't kick the hornet's nest and spend the rest of the day running. That could be, did you pick that up from somewhere or did you make that up?
I grew up in the South, and I came across a few hornets nests in my day, but
That should be on a shirt. That's amazing.
yeah. It applies, man. What can I tell you? It's nothing you
Hmm.
want to tangle with early in the morning. So.
So so you did a lot of the experimenting and just kind of like walked, step by step into it. And that's a big thing, just taking small steps, small changes and seeing how you respond. And so that's great that just kind of, that's the approach you ended up taking. And now fast forward to today. So what does it kind of look like in terms of nutritional management of yourself, as well as exercise? What are you doing to stay the way that you are with your blood sugar and fit and being ready to fly it, how are you approaching it all right now?
Yeah. So, you guys have made, forgive me if you've already said this, via your own content, but, I feel like there's a lot of analogies you could use, but, the three really important, tools or pillars or foundation that I think for health, and as it relates to, if you have good health, you'll have much better diabetic management if you're a type 1.
Mm-hmm.
And without sounding, offensive to those that have been diagnosed with type 2, until you're very far down that disease track, I do feel like that's a disease you can put into remission. I don't feel like you
Mm-hmm.
can cure it, but I do feel you can reverse it and put it into remission through proper nutrition,
Mm-hmm.
exercise, right? And, just, I guess due diligence is a good way to say it, and consistency, right? So
Mm-hmm.
to answer your question, as far as my nutrition now, where, we find ourselves is that the closer you can get to, what I call real whole foods, the better. How you
Mm-hmm.
choose or what those whole foods are for you. There's a lot of dogmatic, bleep this out if you need to, but pissing contests between, the like carnivore crowd and then the plant-based / vegan crowd.
Mm-hmm.
And, hearing all these and, listening to a lot of other health and fitness podcasts and so on, and, some of the other content on social media and so on, the common thread between those, and I think that people would find, or the greater good for people or the population health, would be to look at the commonality between those camps, which is
Mm-hmm.
most of them will agree upon the fact that the less or the more you can reduce the amount of processed, packaged, multi-chemical ingredient foods that you consume, the better. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I do practice a fairly low carbohydrate diet, but another kind of phrase or coin thing that I like to, describe when I'm talking to people about this is, I don't look at it like a low carbohydrate approach. I look at it like a normal carbohydrate approach. And
Mm-hmm.
my contention to that is that based upon the way that our health as a country and as a world, the trajectory that we're on right now, going back to my Southern roots, it ain't good. All right. I think you guys can, agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, um, you know, as long as you can, really concentrate on, those items, and where I go back to the normal carbohydrate, I usually stay at most, probably, even when I'm very active, doing a lot of mountain biking, a lot of hiking, racing, all that kind of stuff. It's extremely rare that I would ever go over 100 carbohydrates a day, and that's
Wow.
with, a significant amount of activity throughout the day. Other days when I'm doing a long shifts at work, I might be as low as 20 or 30. It just depends on what I'm doing for the day. And then, your fitness and activity level, will obviously affect your carbohydrate tolerance,
Mm-hmm.
not only for that day, but for sequential days.
Mhm.
But, another thing with going back to the real whole or more natural foods, your body can tolerate, a sweet potato. But when you take a sweet potato and you put, 30 grams of brown sugar in it, and you put cinnamon sugar on top of that, and then you put marshmallows on top of that, um, that's a rough spot, man. Like that's just, can you never have that? No. I mean, if you have it a couple times a year, your body, is an amazing,
Mm-hmm.
eloquent, thing. But, you do that 2, 3, 4 times a week, 5 times a week, it's not going to turn out well.
Mm-hmm.
So, But yeah, I would say, I do tend to eat, a decent amount of meat for sure.
Mhm.
A lot, avocados, make like, some like kind of bready type products, with like almond flour and flaxseed and, that kind of stuff. But we really try and cook at home as much as we possibly can. Even before the whole, COVID debacle,
Mm.
we didn't eat out very much, mainly because we feel like the quality of food that we can make at home is so much better than
Oh, yeah.
anything you're going to get at a restaurant. Without going on too many tangents, one thing that I noticed from an inflammatory standpoint, which is a big offender of health in
Hmm.
general, is, by staying away from the processed foods and staying away from eating out at restaurants, we stay away from seed oils, because those are really inflammatory fats.
Yep.
And, there's another guy that has a podcast called, uh, well, he has a book out, and his name's Vinny Tortorich. Have you ever heard of him? It's called
Mm.
Fitness Confidential. But he has
No.
a kind of a theory that I keyed into a long time ago, which he kind of really breaks it down very simply. And I don't think he'll sue me because I've been on his podcast, but it's called NSNG, or no sugars, no grains, right? And it's as simple as that. And so he's a cancer survivor, and he came into that mindset, not only before his cancer diagnosis, but he decided he wanted to try and maintain a fairly high level of nutritional ketosis as a means of cancer prevention after his diagnosis of leukemia that almost killed him, and he recovered from. Um,
Mm.
but that's a simple way that I kind of go about things. Like stay away from all the processed sugars, sugar alcohols, even some naturally occurring sugars, and then grains. I just don't eat a lot of grains, and by those two components alone, kicks most processed foods out of the equation, and it kicks a lot of carbohydrates out of the equation, and puts you into more fibrous, more nutritionally savvy and nutrient dense carbohydrates when you do have them. So yeah, that's kind of where I go with that. And I don't really identify with, like, I'm not keto, although I have tested my ketones, especially after long mountain bike rides. And yeah, I'm at 2, 3 millimoles. But that's kind of the way your body's supposed to work. Last time I checked, is that when you're metabolizing fat, you're supposed to have some ketone bodies circulating in your bloodstream. It's not a bad thing. Would you guys
Right.
agree?
Oh yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. I need to, because I'm not Grady or I are not big like keto heads by any
Yeah.
means, and because you can go far down that
Oh
both
yeah.
just rabbit hole or literature reading, because there's a lot of research in that. But I heard, I think it was on the Peter Attia podcast. I might have even brought it up on here before, but hearing a professional cyclist be a ketogenic diet, but still able to keep like 300 carbs a day, but still being ketosis because of how much he's burning and how fat adapted. Like, I don't even know how that actually works, if I admit honestly. But yeah, ketones, when you're burning fat and using fat as fuel and have the right output of energy sources and input, yeah, that's exactly what's supposed to happen.
Mhm.
Um, how do you with these long bike rides? How do you, because let's say like a goo, right? Like if you have goo fuel and like those types of things, obviously very processed. You know, how do you manage such long bike rides or long athletic endurance events while keeping such low carb?
Yeah, so like a lot of things, it's just like training. When you're
Mhm.
lifting, or you're coming into a certain level of endurance for an activity or what have you. You have to give your body time to adapt, right? If you're having a higher carbohydrate diet, and maybe you're consuming, whatever, we'll just say 300 grams of carbohydrates a day. If you decide on Monday morning that you're going to, go keto, which I despise that term, but um, yeah, again, it's not going to turn out well because your body isn't used to doing it. That would be the equivalent of, oh, by the way, I enjoyed your running episode. It would be the
Oh.
equivalent of deciding to go right from the weight room, doing heavy deadlifts and squats, to running a marathon. Could you do it?
Hmm.
Feasibly, yes. but it's, your ankles are going to feel like freaking elephants the next day. I mean, it's just, it's, your body's not trained for it. Can it be trained? Absolutely. So where I was going with that is that, over the course of, modifying my nutrition and gradually reducing the carbohydrate content, because of how active my wife and I are, I figured, okay, how do I need to fuel and modify my insulin regime and modify my nutritional regime, both off, or off the bike and away from other training, and on the bike, because obviously you have to be able to maintain stability and safety, especially when you're very remote. I mean, some of the rides that we do, we'll hop on our mountain bikes, and if we're doing a big ride, we're 15, 20 miles away from the car, and that's nowhere to have an unexpected, uncontrolled low,
And you're also literally in the mountains, like you're in Colorado, like your elevation is way higher too. So you throw that factor there too.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of the rides that we do where, our starting elevation is above 9,000 feet, so, and then we'll go up into the, 10s and 11s, 12s, so it was just a matter of gradually working into that and getting your body accustomed to that, so you weren't as reliant upon as many carbohydrates. And then also the carbohydrates that I do eat, I try and mix those, to be slower acting. There's a few sports specific products that are, utilize a resistant starch, which, basically breaks down lower in your intestinal tract. And one of which is a product called UCAN. You guys may have heard of that, which is a resistant starch that's a corn-derived starch that was originally derived for children that had a metabolic disease that makes them incapable of storing glycogen. I can't remember the name of the condition, but they derived this for a medical treatment originally, so that it dissolves, or rather digests very slowly, and gives you a nice, very level release of, or rather digestion of those carbohydrates for those children, so it could sustain them for 12, 24 hours at a time, so they weren't constantly having to eat all the time, because if they didn't, they would pass away. So this product UCAN, will basically give you a nice, gradual kind of release, and it doesn't give you the huge spikes. And then of course you can take, modify how many grams of carbohydrates you're putting into the mixture by how much you mix. It's just like protein drink or something. One scoop is 20 grams, 2 scoops is 40 grams, that kind of stuff. So I started utilizing that product, and then I found another product that uses a pea starch, which is another resistant starch that basically doesn't give you a huge spike. It just will last multiple hours and kind of give you the equivalent of maybe eating half a glucose tab every 30 minutes, but it's relatively low carbohydrate. So it would, like, for example, 1 scoop of that resistant starch is about 20 grams of carbohydrates, but it's only 80 calories. And so, I've kind of gotten in myself to the point, so is my wife, where we can take basically a scoop, maybe 2 of that resistant starch, so 40 grams of carbohydrates, and that's enough for me to do a 4-hour mountain bike ride, 5 hours, no problem. And the physiology behind that is, once you get to it and you get your body used to accessing and metabolizing fat, fat oxidation as a fuel source, it again kind of goes back to that 80-20 rule that I know doctors Finney and Bullock, they have a book called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Nutrition, and then they have another one specific for athletics. And I went to Ohio State, and they were actually doing some of that research when I was at Ohio State. This was back in the early 2000s. Basically what they showed is once you give the body adequate, and that's the key there, is adequate adaptation time, that it's capable of providing about 75 to 80% of its energy needs through fat oxidation. And then you have like that last kind of, 20, 25% that, especially if you're doing like a mixed type of activity like mountain biking, where you have spurts of very glycolytic activity combined with endurance, you do have to have some glycogen, right? And a lot of times that's, in those activities, you can't necessarily produce it through the liver at an adequate rate. So that's where that little bit of extra carbohydrate comes in to kind of, give you that bump so you're sustaining your glycogen levels over a prolonged period of time. Because most folks, our size, and you guys look like bigger guys than me, but most people store about, if you want to go to caloric equivalents, about 2,000 calories of glycogen or glucose in their body at any given time, in their muscles and liver and other tissues. And if you deplete that, then that's where the bump comes in. But if you can kind of take a little nibble out of that 2,000 calories, because you're fat adapted, and then use the rest of your energy needs from body fat or some exogenous fat, I believe that that's a very efficient and natural way for the body to be able to perform, especially over long periods of time or endurance activities. And even more things like weight training. I mean, you have more than enough glycogen in your body right now to go do a really significant hour-and-a-half long workout, provided you're used to it, right? Fasted workouts, you guys have talked about that. I do fasted workouts pretty much every morning because you're so stable. I basically can run to the gym for a mile, do weights for an hour, 15 minutes, and run home. And as long as nothing weird happened, I'm sitting there flatlined at between 90 and 120 the whole time. So same kind of idea.
Wow. Yeah, you, with your exercise science physiology background, I feel like that's giving you a really good advantage to understanding and jumping right into this, self experimentation and learning how to do a lot of this stuff. But at the same time, you've done these things and they've been basic changes. And so I almost wanted to say before, if anybody's listening to this and thinking about all the things that you or maybe any other diabetic has done and think, oh, well, they've had, so much training and knowledge in it. Well, I mean, yeah, that's helped. But at the same time, the things that you've done, anybody can do. And it's not like this super complex things. Like you said, you just start making small changes, and that adaptation time, all processes take time. And, if you continue to put in the work throughout a long period of time, you can figure out how to have 40 grams of carbs for a 4 or 5 hour bike ride. That is possible even without extensive science training. So.
Yeah. And on that note, going back to the nutrition side of things, I'm also a firm believer in a lot of this stuff, quite frankly, is free. There is no, supplements help, and for some things, but you can have profound positive impact on your health through basically just focusing on food, what you're eating, what you're not eating every day. Sleep, you guys have talked about sleep, that's massive. Stress, all these things. Not sitting in front of a TV, 72-inch giant TV, right before you go to bed and getting blue light all over you, which some people think that's a little weird, but it's 100%,
Oh yeah.
and through brain science. Put some blue light glasses on, if you're going to do that. Yeah, all these things are not, they're not available to just the 5%, right? I mean, some of the stuff you hear about, like, oh yeah, get yourself a red light, sauna, which they're awesome, but they're also like $5,000. So I don't have one, they're cool, but I don't have one. But a lot of this stuff really is, it's free. You just go try it, it's not going to hurt. And then, like going to the diabetic side of things again, since my diagnosis, I've chosen I've been on MDI the entire time. I'm not on a pump. That I figure that might come up at some point. And some people say, well, why haven't you tried a pump? And quite frankly, I just haven't had the need. I just don't feel like, plus, the activities that we choose to do, being in remote locations, backpacking, being in the backcountry, camping, all that kind of stuff. I don't particularly, a CGM is great. It's a massively, it's a great tool, and I'm fine with the CGM, but I just also, haven't felt the need for it. And then the reliability, and I just don't really like the idea of having something like that attached to me. That's a personal choice. And then going back to like some of the endurance activities that I do, I've also talked to some other very high level type 1 endurance athletes, and even some that are using a pump will actually utilize Levemir or Lantus as their basal insulin, so that when they detach from their pump, they at least have the basal on board, so it prevents getting the spikes when they're doing long efforts of multi-hours. And that's kind of what I do when I'm doing these big bike rides, is that I don't have any rapid acting insulin on board. I basically will just modify my basal, and then I don't have issues. So
Right. Yeah, that's I think for really long term in terms of athletic events, that's a superior strategy to the pump in the long term. Personally, for me, if I were to, it's been a dream of mine for a little bit now to do an Ironman and get into the triathlon type stuff, and that type of therapy I think is superior in that context. And so, but I think a lot of high athlete, whether you go, in Instagram world or just blog space or in terms of type 1 diabetes, there are so many people that combine MDI and CGM, and they find mastery in that. And it's all personal. It's all personal choice. I don't think one strategy is better than the other. But I think that's really awesome how you've learned how to balance those things, both from a mindset, you're doing something that you want to do. You don't want to have a pump, so you're not using a pump, but you found ways to use shots and not feel weird and do all these other things, and have really, really good health outcomes with that, which is, I think, one of the biggest goals we're all looking for.
Yeah.
So.
And, on that point, this kind of again goes back to the nutrition and the stability. I'm a firm believer that it would be very, very difficult to attain, the parameters that I aim for on MDI if I was eating higher carbohydrate processed foods. Not to say it can't be done, but I think it would be far more difficult and require a lot more, I don't want to say attention, but it would be a much smaller and more rapidly moving target. Let's say that, it would just be it would take a lot more attention. And that's another thing I feel like by focusing on your nutrition and your exercise, you're taking less mental energy to maintain your diabetic control than you would be otherwise, So that's just what I found.
So with that, because you said in one of your emails that you end up, or maybe I read it on another blog post, that you do nutrition counseling with other type 1s or with other pilots even, or what's that like?
Yeah, it's kind of a hobby. I don't, I don't have a business, or I don't, charge, fees or anything like that. But I've worked with through my airline and just there are some diabetic pilot groups out there. I've just, because of some of the things that I've found out and my experiences, I just wanted to share those with others, so that, maybe either people who are newly diagnosed, or maybe who are type 2s and that have, in my opinion, not been given the whole story, to put it nicely. Or their CDEs or their endocrinologists just quite frankly don't have time to give them the adequate information. Knowing what we know about the healthcare industry, they're very limited on their time and how long they can have them in a clinical visit. I just started to kind of mention to folks like, hey, I found out some pretty cool stuff. I've been able to have some really good results. If anyone wants to talk about it, wants wants a little bit of advice, more than happy to help you out. And so I've had a number of type 2 diabetic pilots reach out to me, and just working with them and giving them some some resources and some basic nutrition ideas. 3 of them that I've worked with have basically completely put their type 2 diabetes into remission and are no longer diabetic.
That's awesome.
With no medications. And because of that, they've now taken that trajectory of, that old school mindset of type 2 diabetes being chronic progressive and basically incurable, to saying, oh, actually, it is no longer progressing. It's not chronic. And as long as you sustain your lifestyle and your nutrition protocol, you will be bothered with this no longer, and it will not affect your career and your health. And, they're sold. And, with other type 1s, I'm not dogmatic on the approach or the camp of nutrition that you want to go into, but I'm definitely a big, I like to prophetize a little bit about the advantages of getting away from the processed foods and, being smart about what carbohydrates you eat, if you're going to eat them, and how many of them, when you're going to eat them, how that pertains to your insulin regimes for the type 1s. And so just, working with folks. And my goal there wasn't to say, look at me, I know all this stuff. It's just to say, I found out some cool stuff. If you'd like to hear about it, I'm more than happy to share it with you. So.
Wow, that's really cool. And you're doing it purely from a point of, wanting to just get back. Like, you've learned these things, so let me help you, which is the most authentic, like that's how it should be. you know? I think, we mentioned a few times, and it's like the most true thing, which you've already said, but to repeat it, the more whole foods, the more natural, less processed is the commonality in so many of these diets, right? And it's almost like I listened to the Mastering Diabetes and Carnivore MD podcast. I'm not sure if you've listened to that episode back in April or something like that. And they really get into it, but it's like whatever, and I loved it. But it's like whenever you have those like heads that really bud, like no matter what, like the common white flag is like, all right, everyone stop eating processed foods, like, but that is the truest thing, and that will get you 80-20, that will get you to the 80% there. That will be probably one of the best advices you can get and implement if you're not doing it, and see such a drastic health change. And then the more dialed in you are, that's when you can start having those nuanced conversations. But like, if you're trying to give the best advice to the most people, that's the most commonality, like that's it, so
yeah, for sure. I totally agree. I mean, with that, it's I've heard the Mastering Diabetes guys on a few podcasts, and it's always entertaining. And I don't know how much if you've read any of their book, and I'm like, all right, so I'm one of those people. I'm like, well, before I sit here and derive an opinion, I got to read the book, and so I read it, and again, it's there's some good science in there, with some interjections that I don't quite agree with. I've heard the guy talk about how he's going to go eat dinner and he's going to have papaya, kale, and like some raisins or something with some bananas for dinner. I'm like, that doesn't sound particularly appealing to me. I'll go ahead and take my sirloin with some green beans and whatever on the side. That sounds more appealing to me. But it's one of those things where, like you said, the commonality is like, hey, let's get away from all the processed foods, and then you can talk about like some of the nuances as far as the particulars, and trying to be very specific about what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And then you get into these whole discussions about the gut microbiome and intestinal permeability, and what affects that, and like the autoimmune diseases and all the inflammatory stuff. And you can go down all these tangents, but if people get kind of overwhelmed by that, they're just like, oh, there's so much, you get that analysis paralysis, right? You just get this overload of information, and then you decide to say, well, I'm not going to do anything because this is confusing. That's why I'm just like to hammer that home. Just try and focus on the quality of your food and the nutrient density, and then start looking at some of these nuances, and that can improve your diabetic management and your health like folks that I've worked with that are interested in weight loss, right? I'm a big fan of the phrase, fix your health and your weight will self-regulate. Like if you're truly healthy, your body doesn't want to be overweight. It's become that way because we've completely hijacked our metabolic and our hormonal health. And if you can re-regulate that, through proper nutrition, it'll take time, but it'll come around. It's sort of like, I'm sure you guys come across folks like that too, where they want to lose whatever 60 pounds in 3 months, and you're like, well, it probably took you 2 or 3 decades to get to the point where you're at. I don't think that's a fair expectation of yourself to fix that in 3 months.
Right. Yeah, I agreed. And the people I've worked with so far, it's that very same approach. It's almost like I try to convince them to be, let's make that a positive side effect. Like my goals for you want to be quality of life in other ways. The weight loss is not a random, but I don't even want to consider it as a metric in terms of what we're shooting for. I'd rather just shoot for other things, whether it be blood markers or how you're feeling or your symptoms or, all these other things. That's what, and then let that weight shed off or, just be shed, grammar, whatever. But yeah, no, I think that's a very realistic approach, and hopefully somebody who has had that much weight for that long doesn't have that expectation, but whatever.
Yeah.
But okay, so I wanted we kind of took a pause for the aviation story, so getting back to it, right? So you've now been working with other pilots and other groups, and as well as physicians trying to create these standards for care, right? And not for care, for standards for what is acceptable or not for these class 1, 2, and 3 license. So as it stands now, how is it, and what is the progression of it? It seems like this past year has had a lot of momentum. So what is it like looking forward, and the state of, as 2020 wraps up?
Yeah. So just to real quickly, just to clarify, in the aviation world, so to speak, or in the flying world, you kind of have 2 components, if you will. You have your pilot certificates, which are sort of like your driver's license. Basically, it's the pilot certificate itself is a certification of your skills and knowledge, right? So you have to go and get flight lessons and learn how to fly, and learn the knowledge set for charts and navigation and systems and all that kind of stuff to operate an airplane, right? So that's your pilot certificate. And then with that pilot certificate, you must hold, depending on what level you're going to exercise or what qualifications you have with your pilot certificate, you then have to have a medical certification that basically is an attempt to make sure that those folks that are operating the aircraft are fit to do so, because ultimately you're taking a giant piece of metal full of fuel and propelling it through the air, and you don't want people to have weird stuff happen and crash into people, right? So there's a medical component to that. And so for like private operators, they will generally have what's called a private pilot's license, and you can have an instrument rating on top of that. And that allows you to go out and fly relatively small airplanes for private use, not for hire. And with that, you need to have what's called a 3rd class medical. And even prior to 2015, you could have a special issuance 3rd class medical with insulin treated diabetes, provided you submitted the right medical records and were in acceptable control. Once you get above the private pilot certificate, you then have to hold either a 2nd or a 3rd class medical, which allows you to operate for compensation or hire, as the terminology reads. In my case, when I was operating as a on-demand cargo pilot, and then also as an airline pilot, you have to hold the highest of those medical certificates. And also consequently, you have to hold the highest level of qualifications from your pilot certificates, which is called an airline transport pilot certificate, which allows you to operate very large aircraft with jet engines and that type of thing on them. And with that first class medical until last year, it was not prohibited, but it was also had never been one issued to an insulin dependent pilot. So the advocacy that many others and then I kind of joined into was to pressure the FAA to come up with a protocol based upon factual information from other countries and clinical standards and clinical research and the advent of the reliability of CGMs to say, let's come up with some protocols to say if these pilots can meet these parameters, then they should be able to hold this special issuance medical. And on that note, those first class medical, the special issuance medicals, depending on your age, so if you're under the age of 40, they're only good for a year. And you have to continuously provide new data to show your continued compliance with these parameters. And for myself, I'm over 40, and so I have to submit all this information, and the medical is only good for 6 months. So you have to, again, show continued compliance with these parameters on a 6-month basis. And they're very comprehensive. The current one has a battery of tests that they want to see, blood work, statements of treatment of care from your endocrinologist, your treating endocrinologist. I have to have a cardiac risk evaluation done. I have to have a treadmill stress test done for cardiac damages because that's again associated with poorly controlled diabetes. An eye exam by a board certified ophthalmologist.
Wow.
Yeah, and then you have to go to a flight surgeon and have a physical exam done. And let's see what else is on there. You have to turn in your CGM data in a monthly format, printed out, or rather, from like the Dexcom Clarity, the AGP reports, along with all of your weekly graphs for 12 months prior to your date of application. And then the parameters they want your blood glucose values to be between now is between 80 and 180. And then any excursions outside of those parameters, particularly on the low side, if it's below 70 for more than 30 minutes, they want that documented and a reason why it was below 70 for more than 30 minutes. And if it goes below 60 for more than 15 minutes, they want that documented and a reason why it went below 60 for more than 15 minutes. So that's where the current protocol sits. And there's a lot of parameters in there additionally. And then most recently, one of the nonprofits that I work with is called Pilots for the Advancement of Medical Standardizations in Aviation, PAMSA, which it's very wordy, I know, but we couldn't come up with anything better.
They'll
Plus,
work it
if you're
out.
in aviation, we just love acronyms, so we just feel like, let's go throw that out there. But anyway, what we're trying to get, like kind of the last piece of that puzzle is that those of us, there's about 25, 7 of which have been approved to date for first class medicals. The last piece of that puzzle is what they're looking for from a standard deviation and then a coefficient of variation, which is kind of where the medical field is kind of transitioning, because they're looking at with someone who is able to use or is on a CGM, those time and range variables and then standard deviation and so on is actually they're finding is to be a better indicator of diabetic control and health than to say, well, your A1C is 5.5, because as we all know, and you guys have talked about, you could have the crazy roller coaster going and still have a relatively decent A1C, but that's not necessarily as good as someone that's like at 100, but their standard deviation is 20.
Right.
So anyway, so that's what the FAA is finally looking at. And then with time and range, they're looking for that time and range to be in excess of 85%. And with lows being less than percent of time low, less than 10%. And then high, they're not as concerned about. We haven't really been able to pry those numbers out of them yet. And quite frankly, it's so new, I don't think that they've established those yet.
Sure.
But as those standardization or that standard is being known, we're trying to disseminate that so that other people that are wanting to put applications in have the correct numbers to aim for, to hopefully make their approval process as seamless as possible.
Wow. At first, and I was gonna make the joke like, "That's it. That's all I need." But because that sounds like a lot. But let's say I'm trying to think about and take the perspective of non-diabetes out, and so I feel like a lot of those regulations, physical exam, there are a lot of things to get those medical, that medical part of that certificate, even without diabetes. Like it's so well regulated that if you're pursuing aviation, I feel like that is almost a commonality that you already have to accept. Does that kind of sound true?
It does.
Mhm.
The running joke around my work is generally aimed at me, which is you're probably the fittest guy in the building and you're the only one that doesn't have a friggin' medical. So,
Wow.
but to speak to that, they're just like the general population. Pilots are no different. There's people who are very healthy, and there are people who are, whether they realize it or not, are kind of teetering on the edge of
Okay.
losing their medical. And there's a wide range of that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's again another
Okay.
push there is that trying to make that known in the aviation community of why it really is important to maintain your health so that you don't have to go down. And I tell people this all the time. I'm like, getting a special issuance medical, even if it's not diabetes for any reason, now you're dealing with the government and you're dealing with turning in a lot of paperwork and jumping through a lot of hoops.
Yeah.
And if you can avoid that, do everything you can, because man, once you go down that road, it's tough. It's not.
Yeah.
It's very, very irritating.
Yeah, no doubt. And I'm glad you clarified that, because I was going to go two different routes. But, as somebody who might be type 1 diabetic or in a similar situation as you, and now you're fighting for having all this criteria so that way it's possible, right? Now there's an actual door to walk through to make sure that you can, return as a pilot. But if you're seeking that as a goal, that sounds really daunting. Oh, I need to have this percentage, need this standard deviation. Like, even if you're really number focused, that seems like so hard to make that your goals. But at the same time, going back to what you've already said and what we've kind of already said in this podcast is that, keep it simple. When you start focusing on your health, the rest will kind of follow. Same thing with the weight. And if you focus on your health and nutrition, those diabetes numbers will follow as well, ultimately too. And so it might be daunting and it'll be a huge success once those are really solidified for this criteria. But then if anybody sees those and feel like it's daunting, then take a step back and be like, all right, basics. What do I really need to do to achieve those results? It's like in a sport, you shouldn't participate and go win a tournament for the trophy. You win the tournament for the sake of winning, and then the trophy is the side effect kind of thing, So.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
I
I have another question about just like, is there a difference between the, I guess the bar for class 1, class 2, class 3? Because I'm sure there's diabetics out there that may not be necessarily interested in commercial flying, but may want to do private flying if they have or want to have their own plane or something like that. Is there less, or I guess, is that window bigger for class 3, or is it kind of across the board the same?
Yeah, that's actually a really apt or a very good question. Yeah, so for private pilots, folks that, as you were saying, that maybe just want to fly as a hobby, or basically have their own aircraft, or they're in a flying club. There's lots of flying clubs out there. That's how I got started years ago. Or ways to rent airplanes and want to start flight, learning how to fly. The third class medical, they've issued, that's a much more streamlined process because it's been around for about 8 years, I believe now, maybe a little bit more, but it's much more established. It's going to be a little bit more, they're going to require basically it's a worksheet that your treating endocrinologist needs to fill out. And as long as you're under 40, it's just going to require a little bit of lab work and then an eye exam outside of your normal flight physical. But other than that, you'll send it into Oklahoma City and they'll review it. It might take, a month or two for them to get through the review process. But for, non-commercial flying, the third class medical, there's quite a few of those that have been issued. To my knowledge, there's a little over 1,000 of those total in this country that have been issued. Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely, and I've had a third class medical, for the last 4 years while I've been, involved in this whole process. So I've been able to fly, privately myself in smaller aircraft. So yeah, that's absolutely attainable. And, if people are interested in going out and attaining that, there's, a lot of good resources out there. And, if there are people that hear this, they're interested in that and want more detail on it, if you want to include my email with the show notes or something, I'd be more than happy to talk with folks about that for sure. Yeah.
Wow. So what is the next steps then? What are looking towards 2021 and kind of trying to make this process like finalize? What's kind of the timeline that you think is going to happen? Obviously, that glacier pace of the government is always there, but what does it look like moving forward in the future?
Yeah. So basically, the very I guess pinnacle of the goal of this particular item is to have the process understood well enough at the FAA and streamlined to the point that when an applicant submits all the required data that's on the protocol, that it can be looked at, assessed, and either approved or denied. And if it's denied, then issued a reason for that denial so that the applicant can make those changes or improvements in a timely fashion. And why I say that with a timely fashion, myself along with the other applicants, I said 7 have been approved to date, all of which put their applications in between November and December of 2019. And myself along with about 22 other people are still waiting our application final approval. So I've been waiting or coming up on a year now of to have all my stuff looked at and approved. And so, and the short-term goal is, myself along with the other people is to have those applications approved and then use the kind of this first group of guinea pigs, if you want to think of it that way, to make or to I guess look at us, because I'm sure they're using us as a data point too, because they're going to keep close tabs on us because they want to make sure that this wasn't Pandora's box they just opened up. But it goes back to like all those parameters I talked about. Like you have to stay on top of this, or they can rescind that medical. It's not you get it and you're done. It's constant maintenance, just like diabetes. But our goal is just to have the process such that if people are willing to put in the time, effort, and dedication it takes to not only learn the skills and the knowledge of flying airplanes, but also the skills and knowledge required to maintain their health or diabetes to the level required for that special issuance, that they can make that application. It can be looked at and approved in, maybe like the 2 to 3 months time frame, maybe even less, but not have it be, the very arduous process that we're currently undergoing right now, where it's really only going through 4 or 5 people in Washington, D.C. That have the authority to approve these medicals right now. And so that's where we want to move forward into, hopefully in early 2021, is getting these approved and then those people, most of which I'm in personal contact with, just being rock solid on their control so that we can say, look, this was not a mistake. This is safe, and we need to continue with this so that this doesn't go away. But, so that's kind of the main goal.
Wow. Wow. And what a historic, historic changes that you guys are fighting for. And some might say, well, it's such a small group of people, but at the same time, for those group of people, it literally could mean the world,
Yep.
Um,
Yeah.
so that's really amazing. And hopefully, it is by 2021, hopefully, the 22 of you get approved soon. And then, it sounds like the people in the other countries that you used as examples, it sounds like there hasn't been any negative, incidences with hypoglycemia or anything like that, or control or anything like that, right?
Correct. Yeah. And actually, Australia was the most recent country just prior to the U.S. approving this protocol. A good friend of mine, Dr. Jeremy Robertson, he was a Qantas Airlines pilot in Australia and was diagnosed as type 1 when he was in his mid 30s. And at the time, it was just like in the U.S. It wasn't, an option for him to return back to flying. So he went back to medical school and became a physician, and is a flight physician and a emergency doctor now. And he was, did a tremendous amount of work in Australia to get their insulin-treated diabetes protocol approved. And he now has his equivalent of a first-class medical and has paved the way for others. So, the reason why I brought that up is that he's been doing some very interesting research and keeping track of these numbers. And to date, there has been no adverse safety-related incidents, or rather safety-related incidents pertaining to insulin-treated diabetic pilots in the flight deck. There's been, but on the contrary to that, there's been multiple instances of cardiac events in commercial airlines. So, it's one of those things where, from the public standpoint, with any of these protocols, CGM is required. And, with that technology in place, we all know that CGMs aren't bulletproof. I mean, but that's part of the user. You have to know how to use the equipment properly, right?
Mm-hmm.
But where I was going with this is that Dr. Robertson has done a tremendous amount of work in this, and, the numbers are there and saying that this is safe. And he's also done some really interesting work with CGM and the relationship between where you have your high and your low values set, and how that then relates to improved health outcomes of diabetics. So basically, the tighter you have those ranges and the less you use a CGM for a don't die alarm, the better your health, long-term health is going to be,
Sure.
And he's done some really interesting work with that to help, add validity to this entire program.
Wow, cool. Now, is it obviously Dexcom is so easy to use, and now Medtronic has their 770G, has an app version of it, but is a lot of this research requiring Dexcom, and obviously no one's really sponsored by any of these companies, but just because it's the lingo, is Dexcom like exclusively what needs to be used to monitor it, or do these regulations, are they accepting Medtronic or Libre data as well, or because it's so new and so strict, they're saying it needs to be Dexcom, we need to be consistent with how we're looking at this data?
So to answer that question, on the official protocol from the FAA, it does not stipulate a brand. It gives requirements of the equipment, of which Dexcom just happens to meet all of those requirements, as does the Medtronic system. And I believe the Freestyle Libre 3, that I guess is only approved in Europe at this time, which is going to be a true CGM where it sends alerts and trends, where the Freestyle 2 does not. You have to scan it, and that's why it's not a true continuous glucose monitor, because it won't alert you to rising and falling unless you scan it.
Right.
So to my knowledge, the only two FDA, and it has to be FDA approved, so that again narrows the field. So the only two systems that I know of right now that are the FAA accepts is the Medtronic and the Dexcom system. There was the Eversense, but that's been, I think in the last 6 to 8 months, that's been, I guess, rescinded from the U.S. market because they were having some issues with it. Yeah, so basically the Medtronic and the Dexcom CGMs are the two that they're willing to accept data from because they meet
Gotcha.
the parameters stipulated in the protocol. So.
Right. Okay. I was just curious, I know I would probably think about that if I didn't ask that to you right now. So I was curious.
And on that note, since we're at, just to further add just a little bit, and this, for anyone that's maybe wanting to go down this rabbit hole, they don't stipulate a particular brand of pump you can use. You can be, you can use a pump, of course. So they don't stipulate a different, specific kind of pump in there. It does give some parameters that the pump needs to meet, but to my knowledge, all the ones that are available in the U.S. meet those parameters. And they also do not stipulate MDI injections. Those are all fine. They also don't have the only type of insulin that I've been able to find in their guide for aviation medical examiners and we actually just had a member of PAMSA denied their medical application because they had used Afrezza, which is an inhalable insulin, which
Right.
some people may or may not know of. And the reason why they denied that medical is because they had not used it in many months, but it was still on their medical file to say that they had at one time been prescribed Afrezza. And their concern there is that, particularly from a commercial aviation standpoint, we have to utilize oxygen masks in emergencies, and that Afrezza inhalable insulin doesn't have enough testing behind it to show that it doesn't cause any adverse damage to the alveoli or the small portions of the lung. And so that's the one insulin that they currently do not approve is the inhalable insulin, but all the other ones are totally fine. So.
That's really interesting. That brings up, a couple different ethical questions. I believe. I thought it was going to go the other way, saying they only allow certain brands, which I thought that was going to be wild if you said that. But I'm glad that that is the only one, and that makes sense. Now, is it more so you think that it's just pure, there's not enough testing with it, or do you think it's more ended up like what kind, or this is where I want to go with this. How does, if the whole fight is to be able to be free and be able to live your life as a diabetic, and that has been shown to have an interesting way of management, that seems like such a weird way to go about it and say you can do everything but that, that seems like, are there people fighting to make that included, or is that kind of just not even, in the words earlier from the podcast, a stone wall because there's just not enough data on that? And I'm sure some people would be upset about that because I know a lot of people love Afrezza, as a method of to quickly combat really fast highs, and I've never used it, but I've read a lot about it and it's very interesting. So ethically, it seems interesting to limit a type 1's method of insulin usage, even though it's just one, for that reason.
Yeah. My interactions with the FAA would indicate that the reason why they've singled out that particular insulin is simply because of the delivery method, meaning that it's an inhalable, it has to go through the lungs, and lungs are pertaining to your ability to absorb oxygen, of course, and how that might then affect your ability to utilize the emergency equipment on an aircraft. Because once you get above a certain altitude, you have to use pressurized oxygen masks to provide enough oxygen pressure for emergency situations at very high altitudes. And I think it's just based upon the fact they don't have enough data, nor was that medication ever really studied for high altitude environments and all that type of stuff in prolonged use, because it might be one of those things where if that's your preferred insulin delivery for, bolusing, that medication hasn't really been around long enough for them to say,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, if you've been using it for 15 years, are your lungs still as viable as they were before?
Right.
Whereas like injectable insulins, whether the delivery method is a syringe, pump, or pen, that's, well proven to say, as long as you're not injecting in the same, 4-inch area and have a giant amount of I can never say that. Lipohypertrophy, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. Hypertrophy. Yeah.
There you go. Thank you.
Mhm.
There's just certain words. Sorry. But as long as that's not going on, they're reasonably sure that, the delivery method is pretty tried and
Right.
true.
Mhm.
And I think it's just the interface of the lungs. They don't like to jack around with the lungs, is quite
Gotcha.
honestly is where that is, I believe. But that's
So,
conjecture on my part.
so is kind of middle length acting insulin, is that still approved in those types of brands? That's still a method that I say that's okay for, as long as you meet the other criteria.
Yeah, you mean things like Novolin R and that, like
Mm-hmm.
regular insulins and those?
Yeah.
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 Yeah, any of the FDA approved insulins
Okay.
are fine. Yeah, I use Levemir, Novolin R, and I use diluted Humalog for my insulins.
Okay. Gotcha. Well, I guess that would be more of a reason to be upset if they started limiting other forms. Like it either had to be, long acting or short acting, in certain brands. But with it only being, the inhalable form, I mean, that makes sense. But I can see where some people could be maybe upset. But at the same time, this is so new for this push.
Yeah.
You gotta take an inch to eventually, give a mile kind of thing, at the same time. So,
Yeah,
uh,
and that's not to say that they won't approve it at
right.
some later point, after they have time, but that's another thing that has added complexity and length to this whole process is the fact
Hmm.
that um, you know the process of a federal or a government entity, particularly the FAA, is staffing. Like they only have X amount of people to deal with
Mm,
this, and then
yeah.
another wrinkle, of course, is the whole COVID situation added more load on the system,
Yeah.
so to speak. And they so getting things pushed through, or even new FDA approved drugs outside of diabetes, is a process to get the FAA to look at it, review it, either approve or deny it. It's a long process. And so, with that, if I'm sure there are people that use Afrezza and, they'd be super pissed about it, but,
Hmm.
um, I guess if you're wanting to go down, or if you're currently using it and you're looking at getting, into commercial aviation, maybe look for some other options,
Hmm.
like Fiasp or one of the ultra rapid injectables. Just, but it might change. I don't know. So
Right. Right. Wow. Uh, well, this has been really enlightening and a really cool subject that, I've enjoyed, this past 90 minutes or so. Let's kind of wrap it up though, John.
yeah,
And I wanted to just three kind of things. Number one is one of our favorite bits is burst my beta cells, and
yep.
just being the grind my gears type of, and it can be specifically diabetic related, something that can be like with your personal management, or it's something that just in general, or something not even diabetes related. So what's something that recently has been bursting your beta cells?
All right. Yeah, I can take a stab at that one. So basically, resignation really kind of gets me a little fired up. And what I mean by that is that can be applied to many facets of life and objectives and just living in general. But applying it to the diabetic, I guess, subject is resignation to just say one of my most despised phrases is, well, that's just diabetes,
Mm,
and as a explanation to something weird that happened.
yeah.
Um, and so that doesn't sound judgmental, because that's not my intent.
Hmm.
Is with that, if something weird happens, or you have a, out of range blood sugar, or, you're struggling with a medication, or, you eat something and it just doesn't go well, um, you know, it doesn't make you a bad person, just because you had, a day or a week or even a month of, less than ideal management doesn't, detract from you as a person. But what I think, what I would prefer people take, or rather, and I strive to try and do this myself, and sometimes I achieve it and other times not, but use that as a catalyst to say, why did this happen? And can I improve upon it? Rather than just throwing up your hands and saying, well, nah, I'm just high today. That's just diabetes. I'm like, well,
Mm-hmm.
maybe not. Maybe look at what you did the day before or 2 days before,
Mm-hmm.
or how well you've been sleeping the last few nights, or whatever it was. Because more often than not, there's probably a reason. You just need to go and find it, and then say, can I improve upon it, or was it something that I had absolutely no control over? And in that case, whether it's you or your child or a friend, give yourself or them some grace and say, you had no control over the fact that, a tree fell on your car and it stressed you out for a week and your blood sugars went to hell. But
Mm-hmm.
that's why it happened. Move on, and then, go from there. So anyway.
Wow. I love it. I love it. Yeah, that's it's kind of similar to what mine's been thinking about a lot this month, being National Diabetes Awareness Month. And I'm sure we've talked about it on this podcast before, but I'll repeat myself because, whatever.
Your show.
But yeah, exactly. It's
You're
but
both show.
you're right, right. But in a similar manner, like a proud owner of a broken pancreas, like in a similar way, it's like it doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to view yourself as broken and as something that doesn't work. Because there are parts of your pancreas physiologically that are still working, and that's fine. But just the mindset of, this is what's happened to me. Oh, well, and obviously it's a joke and, this and that. And I don't want to sound judgmental either. And I think you presented the resignation part in a non-judgmental way, because I agree with you 100%. Like, it's something happens that's unfortunate, but then it's your responsibility to figure out why, and doesn't mean when that doesn't happen, if you don't figure out why, that's okay. But as long, there's always another opportunity to do so. And in a similar way, running that phrase, just every time I see it, I'm just not going to think about it that much, because that kind of frustrates me too much,
Yeah.
So I agree with you 100% though on your perspective of accepting shortcomings of a situation and just saying that's how it is. So what about you, Grady? What's something that's recently been grounding or bursting your beta cells?
I've been having a little bit more interactions with other type 1 diabetics, or people who know type 1 diabetics personally. And I think we've talked about this before, but just the mindset of, and we even talked about this in this podcast, but just the mindset of like only worrying about how much insulin you need to take for a food, not necessarily thinking about how the food is then impacting how hard it is to control your blood sugar. And to me, it's just such a backwards way of looking at diabetes, and it starts in the hospital, because that's what they tell you in the hospital is it doesn't matter what you eat, as long as you take enough insulin for the carbs that's in the meal, you're going to be fine. And that's just been something that's always just so annoying and burst my beta cells, is because I've seen both sides. I've been a diabetic that ate whatever he wanted and ate just like complete crap. And I was able to control my blood sugars technically. Like my A1C looked totally fine. Everybody, my endocrinologist was happy and everything. But when I went to shifting my health, it was a huge difference. My diabetes was so much easier to control, and my life was just so much better. And so now that I've seen the other side of things, when I hear people talking about that mindset, or I'm not necessarily talking about that directly, but just having that mindset. Man, it just makes me want to shake them, wake them up.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too. And then that's kind of like a downer, but it's kind of fun. But John, what's something that too, and I guess I sprung this on you, I didn't put this in the outline, but what is something recently that's made you felt free of diabetes, or something, a situation where it's like, not that it was an afterthought, but something that was like, yeah, that was really cool, and that was, I got to live my life the way I wanted it to.
Yeah, like a diabetic win.
There we go,
Uh,
Diabetic Win. That's what we started calling that segment. Yeah.
okay, yeah. So just basically something where you didn't feel like, or I didn't feel like it just kind of freed you from having to think about diabetes, basically, or
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
okay. Well, yeah, geez, it's gonna sound, like I'm exaggerating, but in the last month, I've had quite a few, just even 2 days ago, my wife and I, went on a nice hike. We had a nice 50-degree day here in Colorado. We went up to Rocky Mountain National Park, drove up there, went on a nice, 6-mile hike. Went up there, went to a nice overlook, beautiful, sunny day, 50 degrees in the mountains, and went up to 11,000 feet and, hung out on the top for a little bit and came back down. And, you know, um, yeah, I mean, except for basal insulin, I didn't have to take any insulin. I didn't have to, do a bolus, didn't have to worry about my basal, it's, you know, right in range the whole time. And, except for looking down at my watch a couple times, that was it. Just all I had to do was worry about is hike. So it was nice. And then, even just, another month beyond that, we went out on a nice 5-day mountain biking trip and took our little trailer out. And, when I'm out, biking and camping and sitting out by the campfire and, just enjoying the time outdoors, you don't, life's normal, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
that those are times when I feel, you know, truly normal, and I don't have to worry about it. So it's nice.
Oh, cool. Yeah, without a care in the world, being able to do all that activity, and just drive and hike and be outside in nature. That's wonderful. It's cool.
Yeah.
What about you, Grade?
So recently I've been changing up or trying out some different types of port sites for my insulin pump.
Mm.
And so there's this one, so I use a Medtronic, and there's a couple different types of sets. I use the standard one, or I have been using the standard one. So I've been trying out the one that actually keeps a steel needle inside
Oh,
you
you
at all
have.
times. Yep. And so the nice thing about it is I don't have to worry about like kinked ports or kinked tubing. And
Wow.
so I don't really have to, question, okay, is it a bad port side or whatnot. So that's been really nice, because I didn't really realize how much I thought about that until I ran out of them. I put one in for the first time, I think this weekend, and immediately I had a bad port. I'm like, oh crap. So that's
Wow.
been nice.
How does it feel different having a metal one then?
No, so I actually got one that's like the very smallest needle.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like 6 millimeters is the smallest one that they make.
Mm-hmm.
And so you really don't feel it at all unless you put it on something that doesn't have a lot of cushion. So like I tried it in one spot that was right on the side of my glute, but it was really close to my the head of my femur. And so sometimes if I laid right on it, I would kind of feel it. Really not
Oh, sure.
initially, but like the longer it was in, the easier it would get irritated. But other than that,
Mm.
as long as it was in somewhat cushiony area, it wasn't too bad.
Wow, nice. And then kind of closing out then, John, whether it's a type 1 who's later in life, is somewhere in their adult life, or somebody in aviation, or a type 1 trying to go into aviation, or just a type 1 in general, what is something that you want to leave them with?
Yeah, I think most importantly is just you know, motivate and or kind of be inspired to educate yourself and you know, and while you're doing that, don't become overwhelmed by the amount of information that's out there. And just like we talked about before, you know, take things or make goals that are, you know, challenging but attainable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, a phrase I use all the time with my you know, professional airline students when they're learning one of our new airplanes or a new fleet type is to say, you know, don't let perfection, you know, get in the way of progression, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes people become so overwhelmed with having to do everything perfect or having to do it right the very first time they try it. When that doesn't occur, which it generally doesn't, then that kind of allows them to, you know, become, you know, not paralyzed, but apprehensive of trying to improve. So, you know, I guess that's
Mm-hmm.
the takeaway phrase is just that, you know, don't let, you know, that perfection stand in the way of progression, and you know, try and move forward.
Wow. Love it. Absolutely love it. Well, John, it's been a complete pleasure to have you on the podcast and to meet you and talk to you about a variety of different things. And we appreciate you coming on and sharing your story and sharing the battles you've had and the progress that you've made in very important field in the federal government in the United States. And hopefully, you know, just continues to have domino effects throughout the world. So thank you.
Great. Yeah, I really appreciate the time. And you guys can edit this out at the end, but if you need to, but would you mind if I just mention one nonprofit
Oh, yeah.
website that can help? You guys probably have heard of it. And
Mm-hmm.
I've gone on and checked it out, and it's a really impressive thing that they're doing. It's called getinsulin.org. Have you heard of
Okay.
that?
Yeah, I have.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's funded by, you know, all the major insulin companies and so on, but
Mm-hmm.
it's a really great website that people can go on to, and you just basically put in, you know, whether or not you have insurance, what insulins you're taking, what your regime is, and it
Mm-hmm.
basically will give you a really clear, concise breakdown of all the insulin assistance programs that would apply that you can use, both from the manufacturers and some of the private entities. And it just gives you like this, they'll email it to you where you can print it out. And then, you know, like for example, I got the my $99 insulin card off of there, but it's a really good resource for folks that maybe don't have insurance, or even if you do have insurance. I don't know. I've been really impressed with that product, and it costs nothing. You don't have to put in any personal information. It's not a
Wow.
pay site. It's being paid for by the sponsors, which are insulin companies, but it does direct you to some good programs. So I don't know. I just wanted to, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you guys probably
And
talked about it already, but I thought it was a really cool thing to offer to people that they're doing.
repeat the name one more time for people?
Yes, it's getinsulin.org.
Getinsulin.org. Yeah, I was just about to ask you and kind of reaffirm if people had questions about aviation, you know, we'll put your email on there, and on other organizations that you're associated with that they might want to reach out or help with. Because I was thinking about other type 1 diabetics and trying to get involved in this if that's what they so chose. So what if other, you know, future pilots that are listening to here also want to help out with that? How could they who would they contact, or what kind of organizations would they look into?
Yeah, so there's a few aspects as far as just general information on aviation and how to get started. If you're maybe wanting to, you know, start flying, or just, you know, really just in the beginnings of it, from purely aviation, not diabetic or related. Uh, AOPA, so that's Airline Owners and Pilots Association. It's a national organization. They do a lot of community information, outreach, education. They have a lot of kids programs. Yeah, they have a huge website with a lot of resources. So that's a really great organization. Um, as far as diabetic specific, there's a number of Facebook groups. The two that I'm most active on is that PAMSA, so that's PAMSA, PAMSA organization. And, if you're interested in that, just, go onto Facebook and type that in, and you can request. Right now we have about 60 members because most of the people on there are commercial pilots. But we're always looking for new members. And we can give you more information on, first and second class medical certification. And then also there's insulin treated diabetic pilots for first and second class medicals. It's kind of wordy, but that's another Facebook group that has a bunch of folks on there. But in the show notes, if you want to include my email, and people, if they just want to reach out to me, I'd be more than happy to answer their questions. On Facebook, it's just my name, so John Roth. I don't hide behind a fake name or anything. And then on Instagram, T1 Flyer, so just lowercase t and number 1, and then Flyer. And I post on there from time to time, but you can always just DM me or whatever. So yeah.
Sure. Perfect. Well, to anyone who's listening and to future pilots out there, we'll link those resources. And John, it's been a blessing and amazing. And I hope, the intention of this was to really let people know that they can do these things. And I think you are an amazing example of that. So thanks for being on, and everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of the Diabetics podcast, and we'll check you out on the next one.
See you.
All right.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you found value in today's conversation, we would appreciate it if you gave a 5-star review. It really helps us branch out our community and get our message across to those who really need to hear it. If you want to interact with us on social media, you can follow us on the Diabetics podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or moral outrages, you can email us at thediabeticspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks.